Okay, we're live.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Carolyn Kilgore, and I'm the Designated Federal Officer, or DFO, for the Science Advisory Board Drinking Water Committee, augmented for the Contaminant Candidate List 5, CCL 5 review. Welcome to the third day of the CCL 5 review. Today is a continuation of the meeting held on January 11th and February 16th. At this time, as DFO, I would like to formally open today's public meeting. The CCL5 committee was established to review EPA's draft drinking water contaminant candidate list and 3 associated support documents. Today, the committee will continue its deliberations on the charge questions about EPA's draft CCL5. As a reminder to the public, there is an opportunity later today for members of the public to provide clarifying comments. Anyone who wants to provide comments may register by emailing me at kilgore.carolyn@epa.gov and letting me know you want to provide comments. My email is also available on the SAB website associated with this meeting. I will now hand it over to the chair, Dr. June Weintraub. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Good morning, everyone. To anyone new listening, my name is June Weintraub. I'm the chair of the Drinking Water Committee augmented for the CCL5 review. Welcome back to all the members and to EPA staff. I look forward to hearing today's deliberations. Before I move on to reviewing Wednesday's proceedings and reviewing the agenda, I'll quickly take roll. So please respond if present. Dr. Craig Adams.
Yes, I'm here.
Dr. Asli Aslan.
I'm here.
Dr. Otap Conroy Ben.
Here.
Dr. James Engelhardt.
Here.
Dr. Celine Hernandez Ruiz.
Here.
Dr. Marc Le Chevalier.
Here.
Dr. Angela Lung.
Here.
Dr. Rainier Lohman.
Here and there.
Dr. Sarah Page.
Here.
Dr. Rebecca Sutton.
Here.
And Dr. Felicia Wu.
Here.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here today. So I'll just quickly review what we did on Wednesday. We discussed charge questions 1, 2, and then the chemical parts for question 3 and 4. We heard from the committee on their preliminary responses to each charge. Today, our first agenda item is to discuss charge 3 and 4, focusing on the microbial contaminants, and then we'll follow that by a 15-minute break. After the break, we'll have an opportunity for the public to provide clarifying comments, followed by the agency and lastly, the committee. As I mentioned yesterday, during this section in the agenda for the committee to provide clarifying comments, lead writers will have an opportunity to provide an oral summary of the key takeaways from the discussion that will be included in the report. If you need to clarify any misunderstandings or request more information from your fellow committee members, you can do so at that time. This will also allow the entire committee to begin thinking about what they want to include in their revised responses in order to support the lead writer's effort. All times in the posted agenda are approximate, and we will likely recess earlier than the 5 p.m. Eastern time posted end. So now let's move on to discussing the microbial contaminants for charge 3 and 4. I think yesterday worked well with me calling on the committee members assigned as lead discussants to first give the opportunity to provide a synopsis of their individual responses, and then having the opportunity for additional committee members who submitted comments to provide their synopsis. And finally, we'll open the floor to the rest of the committee. As a reminder, discussion should focus on the science of the CCL5 and the supporting documents and not on policy. So charge question 3 is on the screen right now, and it reads, based on your expertise and experience, Are there any contaminants currently on the draft CCL5 that should not be listed? Please provide peer-reviewed information or data to support your conclusion. And then charge question 4 is based on your expertise and experience. Are there any contaminants which are currently not on the draft CCL5 that should be listed? Please provide peer-reviewed information or data to support your conclusion. And as a reminder, again, yesterday we covered these 2 charge questions for the chemical contaminants, and today we'll be focusing on the microbial. There is some crossover. I think some of yesterday's discussion included some of the microbial contaminants, and I suspect there could be crossover today, and that's fine. So let's begin with the lead discussants who responded to question 3, and we'll start with Dr. Aslin.
Good afternoon. So during the process, the EPA, after eliminating 1,400 microorganisms and using the 12 criteria, the current CCL ended up looking at microorganisms of interest. What I found that is commendable is that the extending to include the nosocomial agents, especially with Pseudomonas aeruginosa, is important in the CCL. And I didn't see any others that would not be listed as per question 3. Particularly Pseudomonas inclusion is important to me because of also its colonizing and medical devices and medical environment and built environment, but also having the antibiotic resistance significance. For question 4, I would like to hear more about why pathogens such as
you just muted yourself.
I'm sorry, can you hear it now?
Yeah, if you could repeat your the last sentence.
Okay, so I was talking about the salmonella and hepatitis A not being included, and because in that document it was also mentioning that these also have high levels of waterborne disease outbreaks, and it was not clear to me why they were not included. And I based on the literature, I think they should be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now let's move on to Dr. Engelhardt.
Yes, thank you, June. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I don't have any information or any reason to doubt any of the recommendations for microbial contaminants, either for inclusion or not inclusion. So I don't have that, but in my experience. But I do have a couple follow-up questions on comments on questions. So I don't know when the best time would be for that.
I think we will have a chance during the summary portion this afternoon. So the leads for each charge will summarize comments, and then we will have a chance to discuss things globally. So let's reserve that till then for the chemical. Sure. Thanks.
Okay, good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Dr. Hernandez-Ruiz was the lead writer for this group, so I'll let you go last, and let's move to Dr. Page.
Yes, most of my work has been focused on chemicals, so I don't have anything to add to the microbial section.
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much. And Dr. Hernandez-Ruiz.
Morning. I do not have anything to add.
Okay. Thank you. And we had 3 individuals who submitted responses in the written responses, and we'll start with Dr. Le Chevalier.
Yeah, well, I think I didn't follow the instructions on Wednesday, and I already had mentioned this, but for completeness, again, this kind of falls back to the first, response to charge question 1 was around transparency, because EPA, for the purpose of the CCL5, is considering or not considering different microbes to be unregulated, and the transparency or reasons for that are unclear, because many of these are already fall under existing regulations. So I identified adenoviruses, caliciviruses, campylobacter, enteroviruses, and Shigella sonnei as also already falling under existing regulations, either the surface water treatment rule, the groundwater rule, and so therefore the rationale for why these are on the CCL5 is not clear, and they have been on previous CCLs. So they are not driving in water that's properly treated, are not necessarily a problem with overcoming barriers. With maybe the exception that adenovirus has been studied for UV disinfection, and there is some new research showing that adenoviruses are perhaps more susceptible to UV across different wavelengths than just UV 254. So if EPA had justifications for keeping that on, I think it would be helpful. And as I had mentioned also on Wednesday, EPA includes Helicobacter pylori. It's not identified as a cause of waterborne outbreaks in the United States, but has been identified in developing nations. And so if the classification for that was changed from a 3 to a 1 based on its occurrence data, it would rank lower in the list and probably on the preliminary CCL, and therefore probably wouldn't have not made the final CCL. So that I identified that one as questionable, because I had mentioned it was from a 1999 study that used questionable methods. So anyway, so at this point, I would say not put them on. I think there are other microbes when we get to question 4 that are probably higher priority than these organisms. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Lung?
I have nothing to add here. Thank you.
Okay, and Dr. Sutton?
My comments were on chemistry rather than microbes. So
Okay.
nothing to add.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll just add, as I open the floor to the rest of the committee to comment, I really appreciate, as I said yesterday, Mark's careful review of the literature. I think one of the benefits of having so many people with expertise is that each of us actually gets knows specific documents and can remember, oh, this was that study that I looked carefully at 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And I've followed it and know that it hasn't been replicated, and maybe we should not be utilizing it as a large priority of evidence at this time. So I just would like to acknowledge that as time goes by, something new comes out today, it's important for us to consider it, to think about the methods, to look at it, and wait for it to follow it, to see how subsequent studies are able to support or refute or change the way we think about the particular topic under study. So I feel like the Helicobacter pylori is a really good example, and it seems to me that it maybe has just been carried over on the CCLs as time went by, and maybe it's a legitimately time to have it drop off. So does anyone else have comments they'd like to add to charge question 3? The part of what's on the CCL5 for microbial that should perhaps be dropped off. Okay. Seeing none, let's go ahead and move on to question 4 for microbial contaminants, which again is based on your expertise and experience. Are there contaminants which are currently not on the draft CCL5 that should be listed? And please provide peer-reviewed information or data to support your conclusion. So again, we'll go through with the lead discussant starting and with Dr. Aslan.
I think I answered the question in the question 3. So I would just reiterate the same thing. Would it be possible, I mean, in the future at least, to reconsider having salmonella and hepatitis just because of the high levels of waterborne disease outbreaks, to be more on the precautionary side, and that would be.
Thank you. And Dr. Engelhardt.
Yes, thank you. I don't have any comments on this question regarding microbial contaminants. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Page.
Yes, I also don't have anything to add at this time. Thank you.
Okay. And Dr. Le Chevalier.
Okay, so the public comment suggested that EPA considers non-tuberculous microbacteria, or abbreviated NTMs. And I'm really glad to see that EPA did not include that in this group. It's kind of a pet issue of mine, so excuse me for a moment going on a little bit of a soapbox, because NTMs is a clinical terminology for microbacterium infections that are not tuberculosis, which is obviously a primary public health concern on the mycobacteria. And so, they consider, well, infection, mycobacterium tuberculosis infection, and then all the other NTMs, a non-tuberculous, as a other group of pathogens. That terminology has been picked up and applied to environmental microbiology and water, which is really problematic because, by definition, since tuberculosis doesn't occur in water, it's not a waterborne pathogen, every other mycobacteria in water isn't, by definition, NTM, whether they are potentially pathogenic or not. And so it has created, in my opinion, a lot of misinformation, and we're not making a lot, in my opinion, not making a lot of progress in addressing mycobacteria risks, because it's just a mixed pot of everything. And therefore, I think it's been great that EPA identified Mycobacterium avium and abscessus as being on the draft CCL, because it's important to point to the potential health risks of these pathogenic mycobacteria in water supplies. But then EPA has several publications by Donahue and King, which have looked at other pathogenic microbacteria in clinical cases and relationship to water. And in addition to the abscessus Cheloni group, Forturitum, Gordoni, Mucogenicum, Cheloni, Kansasai, and Zenopi all have significant clinical illnesses, and potentially come from lots of different sources, and therefore the role of water as being contributing to these infections, should be addressed. And so I think perhaps the way that EPA could organize this is have a mycobacterium group, and within that group identify these basically 7 or 8 pathogenic mycobacterium as being a focus for studies in water, and that would help then direct the research community from just looking at NTMs, which is basically run a primer for the genus Mycobacterium in water, and you've got and you try to publish that work, versus really trying to understand what are the opposite pathogenic mycobacterium, what are their ecologies and occurrences and modes of exposure, which would be really helpful for us to make progress in addressing mycobacterium infections that come from water. So, I would suggest that EPA, in the CCL, develop this group and support it with publications, several publications they've looked at for, supported by clinical cases of mycobacterium that have environmental exposure.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's give a chance for those who submitted responses to charge question 4 and make sure, I think all of you were focusing on the chemical aspect, but let's just go through quickly for Celine Hernandez Ruiz.
I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Okay, and Dr. Lung?
Same with me, nothing else to add. Thank you.
Okay, and Dr. Sutton?
Yeah, no comments here.
Okay, and I'll go ahead and open to the rest of the committee for questions and to discuss the charge. Go ahead and raise your hand or use virtually or actually. I'll offer my comments. I think I really appreciate Mark's drawing attention to the NTM issue. I think it seems like EPA was trying to apply the grouping approach, and that approach actually may make sense. And so I do have a technical question for you, Mark, of whether we can think about that mycobacterium group, if there's, what the methods are for detection. Is there a way to pick just one or look at them the same way we look at viruses, for example, like as could we use that grouping approach that we're using with chemicals in the same way for microbes, for these particular microbes?
Well, that would be, so by, I think, putting on the CCL and kind of addressing these, ask that question, would be monitoring for, Mycobacterium avium complex, for example, be inclusive of these other opportunistic pathogens or not. So by putting on CCL, that directs EPA to look at the questions of research and health effects, and and formulate a potential regulatory approach. And so I think that's useful. I think it's been not helpful to just call all of these NTM, because there's lots of mycobacterium that have very low public health significance that are captured in that entire genus. I don't think it's helpful and scientifically helpful for us to formulate proper approaches to protect public health when we're simply just looking at the entire genus. And so by creating kind of a pathogenic microbacterium subgroup here would be helpful in just formulating these concepts in people's minds and then focusing the research to these kinds of questions. So yeah, and frankly, the comment has come about adding Pseudomonas aeruginosa, important clinical pathogen. Completely agree that is on the CCL, but we don't look at every other strain or species of Pseudomonas that also cause infection. So we've been able to focus on those that really drive public health risks. And so by not focusing on NTM as a category, but on specific pathogenic microbacteria, and then just for the groups between 1990, one EPA publication between 1994 and 2014, infections with this Abscessus chelonae group increased, and Mycobacterium avium increased by 322 and 149% respectively for Abscessus and avium. So we are seeing increases in clinical cases in this group, kind of paralleling a lot of the same kind of issues we have with Legionella. The challenge with Mycobacterium, it never presents itself as a community outbreak, but as sporadic individual cases. We don't see, outbreaks of Mycobacterium, but when we look at the data, we can see clusters of cases in an area. So it requires a different kind of approach to looking at that data to understand these health risks. The methods, having worked on Mycobacterium 20 years ago and not being known from being a very patient person, the fact that it takes 14 days even for colonies to even begin to show up, it will be all moved to molecular methods. And so developing primers for, or maybe a multiplex PCR for this group of pathogenic microbacteria, I think could be very helpful advancing the science of these organisms in drinking water.
Thank you. I see that Rainier has his hand up, and I don't know, Mark, if you.
Yeah, I do have a question, but go ahead and take.
Okay. All right, let's go ahead with Dr. Lohman then, and then we'll come back to
Am
you.
I correct? I can talk about chemicals now too?
Let's wait for that until after the break. We'll group we'll do that then at the 3:45 p.m. agenda item, which will happen much earlier. Did you have more, Mark?
Yes, I have a question for Dr. Aslan, who suggested putting Salmonella and Hepatitis A back on the list. It was on the CCL4, and in fact, it had been on several CCL before this, and then now on CCL5, these dropped, and so we're a little bit at odds here because Salmonella and Hepatitis A kind of fall under my prior comments that EPA previously had considered them as non-regulated for purposes of CCL, and the rationale for making that decision is not clear, not transparent, is not presented anywhere. It's not on the individual supporting documents. And I think it would be good to have at least some paragraph or justification of what's the thinking of EPA that these are on the list or not on the list. But Salmonella and Hepatitis A would be controlled under the Surface Water Treatment Act and the groundwater rule, surface water treatment rule, and the groundwater rule. And so for Dr. Aslan, yes, there are outbreaks mostly from untreated water or water that is doesn't fall under the Safe Drinking Water Act, and so kind of asked for more justification of why this should be included back on the CCL 5 after EPA had dropped this after CCL 4. Yes, these are important pathogens, and I agree, but water that's properly treated shouldn't have these kind of outbreaks. So help me understand your thinking a little bit more, since I have to write this up.
No, I was just looking at the comments about on the EPA CCL about the reason, the justification for that was, although they were causing waterborne disease outbreaks, the EPA CCL this time dropped it. So really, it was all about, again, yesterday's conversation about being not clear about these justifications. That's why I needed some clarification on that. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, Mark, I really appreciate, again, as always, your comments. I feel like we're starting to approach the concept of, what is the Safe Drinking Water Act, which has been an amazing piece of legislation that has helped us get to this place today with drinking water, and now we're moving into this future where what we mean by drinking water and how it's used is changing. And I feel like the exposures, are not entirely from drinking, and the purpose, and yet we have all these other means that we're evolving. For example, I'm just thinking about Legionella right now. Most of the outbreaks and problems with it are not actually related to ingesting the water, but they are related to how drinking water is, delivered and makes its way to a place where a person can be exposed to a Legionella that has multiplied. And I think we're going to be confronting this as we move into the direct potable reuse. And I'll just put in a little plug for the work. A lot of the work I do in San Francisco is for our non-potable uses program. And I think there's something to be said for figuring out the distinction of, when do we care about what? And again, what other regulations are existing that help make sure that we are caring about the right thing in the right setting.
You're right. Of course, the Safe Drinking Water Act defines potable water is for all uses, including bathing and showering, which includes other exposures. And so, theoretically, under the potable water regulations should fall under all of that, including hot water. And yet all of the regulations and all of our monitoring and of all of our compliance data are on cold water systems. So there are, what you point out is that if we're concerned about exposure to showering or, pathogens or chemicals formed in hot water systems, we don't know anything about that because it's not under our monitoring programs. It's not the focus. And I think there is this question of, does it fall under the regulations? And according to the Safe Drinking Water Act, it does. But according to how we monitor and score compliance, it doesn't. So there are some gaps there. So maybe that's something. Maybe and it's not quite a contaminant, but it falls again under the process of how are we scoring this exposure, what have you, and are we really being in the development of the CCL process, then considering exposures that aren't we think of as being drinking water. So I'll take a stab at putting something together on that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And the other thing I wanted to just highlight that you brought up that I think is useful for all of the charge questions is kind of a reminder that the next step from the CCL5 process is for EPA to think about actually whether to regulate these contaminants. And part of that process includes, understanding what methods are available, understanding the actual logistics of what it would look like to go ahead and put in a regulation for this. So and then supporting the development of research and evidence to make sure that a contaminant selected for regulation from ACCL, this is just the beginning. So I think it's important for us to keep ourselves grounded in the whole process. Did anyone else have comments they wanted to add to this discussion? And again, then we'll have a chance to look at everything as a whole later on in the agenda. Okay, so seeing none, I think we'll go ahead and take a 10-minute break since we're running ahead and we maybe don't need as long of a break right now. After the break, we'll come back and hear from any public commenters. So if any members of the public wish to provide comments, please email the designated federal officer, Carolyn, to let her know. Her email is kilgore.carolyn@epa.gov. So let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break and we'll return at 9:50 Pacific time, which is 10, 11, 12, 12:50 Eastern time. Thank you.
I will be resuming shortly.
Welcome back, everyone, from our short break. We're now at the place in our agenda for comments from the public. And Carolyn, do we have any members of the public who wanted to comment?
No, no one submitted an email to present comments. So we're good to go to the next item.
Okay. So the next item is clarifying agency comments from EPA staff. And I believe that Hannah Holsinger, the branch chief for the targeting and analysis branch, would like to address the committee. Hannah, if you're ready.
Yes, thank you, June. As June said, my name is Hannah Holsinger. I'm the chief of the target analysis branch, which is within the standards risk reduction branch. You heard from our division director on Wednesday. So I'd like to reiterate some of the messages that he provided. First of all, by thanking all of the committee members for your time and participation on this committee. Your expertise and your comments are greatly appreciated and are very useful for us as we move forward and finalizing the CCL5, as well as for development of future CCLs. So wanted to make sure that we thanked the committee here for your time today, last Wednesday in our previous meeting, as well as the time spent reviewing our materials and developing a response to our questions. So thank you so much to everyone. It's incredibly valuable for us. So we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. And also thank you to EPA for the opportunity to review the draft CCL5. Did anyone have any questions or comments specifically for Hannah? Okay. So seeing none, we'll now move on to the clarifying committee comments section of the agenda. And before we go through the opportunity for the lead discussants to provide a synopsis, let's now give a chance for, I know Dr. Lohman had some comments about the chemical components for charge question 3, and if anyone else has overarching comments or comments on one of the charges before the lead discussants give their synopsis, then please feel free to just tee your comments up with a hand raise. But let's turn it to you, Dr. Lohman.
I mean, it's an iteration on a theme, but it would help to better understand what the grouping means for what is included or what is not included as part of charge question 3 and 4. For the PFAS is a good example. And yeah, I can think the only addition I would have made after the discussions we had is to add the total organofluorine as a measurable chemical group. Those methods exist in academia, certainly. So EPA could actually adopt that. That was my late addition.
Thank you. I mean, it's something I've been thinking a lot about, and I think it's this, this discussion has elevated it for me, is what kind of the difference between an indicator approach and a group approach, and then the single contaminant approach. And I'm not sure, and perhaps we'll get a chance to think about this as the process continue, as we wrap up our review process, but whether that ends up kind of going into charge question, which charge question it goes under. I noticed Dr. Hernandez Ruiz, you had your hand up.
Yes, I do. And these are more questions than comments in regards to, for instance, what Dr. De Chevalier was mentioning about adenoviruses, for instance, and how some of those viruses can be or are already addressed by other rules besides the CCL5. And in my mind, and I'm not a microbiologist, but I can see how some viruses may be eliminated or reduced during treatment, but then they can be again reproduced in the environment. And in fact, I'm reading a review right now that talks about adenoviruses and how in instances, and I can put the actual article in the chat so that everybody can see it, how they're not degraded and during wastewater treatment operations, and how they can be exacerbated in the environment, which goes back to the drinking water question, right? So it's more of a clarifying question about how do we know that the surface water treatment rule or the groundwater rule are efficient at mitigating these viruses, you know, and how, what does that mean for the Drinking Water Act?
Thank you. I think the link you put in the chat is to your local copy. So if you have handy the
Sorry,
web
yes.
version.
Yeah, this is available to everyone.
Mm-hmm. And for, I'm not sure if people listening or have access, but it is a link to a published article on adenoviruses.
Right.
So thank you.
Yeah, and it's section 2 that talks about sources and occurrence of waterborne viruses in drinking water supply systems. Mm-hmm. Specifically, that section that talks about, for instance, adenoviruses and how they can end up in drinking water sources.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. So let's now go ahead and have each lead discussant provide a synopsis of their group's thoughts, maybe highlighting any areas that you might request more information from one or more committee members. Remember, our ultimate goal is to have a cohesive report responding to the charge. So this can be a time that we get a little bit closer to a finalized position. And also remember, it's fine for us to have divergent opinions. It can just be noted in the report as such. We don't have to have a consensus. So let's start now with Craig and charge question 1.
Thank you very much, Jen. Yeah, I'm going to summarize then for charge question 1, the group's comments kind of categorized. The charge question 1 was just to remind us all, please comment on whether the Federal Register notice published on July 19th, 2021 and associated support documents are clear and transparent in presenting the approach used to list the contaminants in the draft CCL5. So comments on the overall process, clarity and transparency. Overall, the Science Advisory Board thought the process and the documentation was clear and transparent, and generally they commended the EPA for its level of effort. A few example comments would be, I think the FRN and supporting documents are presented are clear. I think the FRN is well written, clear and transparent. In my opinion, it's clear and transparent. EPA is to be commended for the level of effort. The published FRN and associated documents outline a process that's clear and stepwise in approach, impressive and well documented, high quality and clarity on the whole. I think the FRN was commendably clear. So there's comments along those lines. The next group is there are comments on modifying the term health effects by a number of the members. And here's one example. One minor point would be to consider the term health risks rather than health effects risks or health effects throughout. Another comment, and by the way, I'm just paraphrasing or giving you the outline here without going into the detailed discussions of these things. Comments on rationale for the numbers of contaminants chosen at various stages in the process. One comment was, is there rationale why 250 out of the 22,000 chemicals were selected for inclusion in CCL5? This should be better justified. Another comment was, why were only 214 of the 275 chemicals on the PCCL5 evaluated by EPA? What happened to the remaining 61s? Another class of comments regarded the selection process of chemicals under consideration. For example, in building the chemical universe, it's not clear how EPA counted for the unknown unknowns. And then another has to do with groupings. The table is given to list the DBPs considered, but there are more questions with, for example, the PFAS group. The public may wish to know which PFAS chemicals are considered. Another comment is, for greater uniformity towards the overall process, they suggest listing the eligibility criteria for the chemical contaminants to be screened from the initial universe, and it goes on from there into more detail. It would have been helpful earlier to explain the scoring system that was solely developed for the as an EPA internet or internal tool. Another set of comments was on the selection for microbial contaminants, and says, in general, the draft CCL5 would be strengthened and the process improved for transparency if the EPA can outline in greater detail the reasons why expert opinion weighed more heavily for the microbial list than the chemical list. Another comment regarded the microbial universe begins with a 2001 published list of 1,425 pathogens that can be transmitted by water. The consistency of how the criteria were applied, however, is not always obvious, as discussed below. Finally, the draft CCL5 was generated by weighing data on waterborne disease outbreaks, occurrence, and health effects, resulting in 12 listed. Most of the microbial contaminants were carried over from prior CCLs. The rationale for this continuation was not evidenced from the information provided. And it goes into a lot of detail there. Simply stating that regulated microbes are considered unregulated contaminants for purposes of eligibility for the CCL is not a transparent process. Besides the scoring process, it would be useful for EPA to state on each of the CISs the rationale for inclusion. Another comment is one minor comment: enteroviruses are listed and the public may not know that norovirus is an enterovirus, and norovirus is frequently featured in media stories. Another comment is along the lines, and it has to do with the difference, the drafting of chemical versus microbial contaminants. Each followed a slightly different process. To summarize a lengthy discussion, detailed discussion, reference discussion, it's about expert opinion weighed more heavily for the microbial contaminants than for chemical contaminants. And there's a lot of detail there, but that's the gist. I'll just read one sentence. In contrast to the primarily point-based process followed for drafting the chemical contaminant list, the draft CCL5 microbial contaminant list was formed from mostly expert opinion, EPA and CDC, taking into account the risk scores from the 3 protocols. And then we had comments regarding clarification of the criteria for inclusion or rejection of occurrence data. One comment is along the lines that I recommend clarifying the types of occurrence data that were included or rejected during the development of the draft CCL5, particularly in the literature review. Greater clarity as to which data were considered valid may be sufficient to explain why some studies were included in this compilation process. And a few examples are regarding standardized methods. Are appropriate data limited to concentrations quantified using standardized methods, or can other methods, for example, developed by academic laboratories, be used? Are there estimated concentrations based on passive samplers included? Are the findings of suspect screening and/or non-targeted analyses included? With respect to ambient water monitoring, are there constraints as to the number and characteristics of surface water and or groundwater bodies that would limit inclusion in the occurrence data? There's some examples given. Are reports or commissioned by reports from or commissioned by state agencies included? Again, a lot more details and examples there. And then what ranges of dates were used in assembling sources of information? And they go on to expand on that. Next is, when are wastewater effluent data included and how do these inform the evaluation process? The wastewater data provided from the CISs or contaminant information sheets appeared particularly incomplete. Similarly, or in why were discharges of urban runoff not compiled or considered in a manner similar to the wastewater effluent? Urban runoff can be a major pathway for discharges of some of these contaminants. There was a comment, at least one, I think there are two, on the use of machine learning. A member commented on the lack of machine learning criteria, which can lead to a lack of transparency in the ranking process. There were comments on the use of production volumes as a metric for occurrence. For example, when EPA relied on production volumes, the lower end of the possible production range was chosen rather than a mid-value or even maximum value for conservative evaluation of potential release. This should be better justified. There were comments on the rationale for use of groups within the draft CCL5, and to remind us, we're talking about DBPs, cyanotoxins, and the PFASs. So there was discussion related to the use of groups of compounds in some cases in the draft CCL. So there's a variety of comments here. One is EPA should clarify the rationale as to why and how some compounds are listed as groups, such as the three I just named, while others were not. One example might be triazines. The process and rationale for listing contaminants on the draft CCL5 as detailed in the Federal Register is not clear for three chemical groups. For example, how does listing compounds as a group impact the regulatory process? Because there's diverse health effects and occurrences and so on. Is there a prioritization within the groups given the orders of magnitude differences in concentrations that cause health effects? What is the justification for the choice of definition for PFAS? What is the justification for the choice of DBPs included in the group? Another set of comments had to do with sensitive populations, and that the Federal Register notice contained a great deal of information on this topic when describing health effects for pathogens, but not of chemicals or groups of chemicals. And finally, comments on the use of, there was a comment, maybe there should be more inclusion of European-based data in addition to the US-based data. Another comment or set of comments was on inclusion of cyanotoxins in the draft CCL. So some comments addressed, or several comments addressed the rationale as to why cyanotoxins were included when their occurrence in UCMR4 was generally low. For example, what is the justification for inclusion of cyanotoxins on the draft CCL5 given the very low incidence of occurrence demonstrated in the UCMR4 data? Another comment was, why are algal toxins listed in the draft CCL5 when UCMR4 data showed rare detection of these toxins? That might have been, yeah, so that's right. Other comments along these lines supported the inclusion of cyanotoxins despite the low UCMR occurrence data. For example, cyanotoxins are unique in that occurrence can occur on an acute basis due to hazardous algal blooms of widely varying and sometimes short-lived relative to quarterly sampling periods of time. UCMR was not designed to capture cyanotoxin concentrations triggered by an HAB event or hazardous algal bloom. Thus, concentrations relevant to human health effects may often not be captured in the UCMR approach. And the last comment just had to do with future use, and it had to do one comment related to how information from the process might be used in the future. General information section A might be, there might be one more sentence about how the draft and final CCL will be further used for the regulatory process. So there's a lot more detail here, but those were the main points, June, from our group.
Thank you for that very thorough summary of the rich discussion that we had on charge question 1. Does anyone have any clarifying remarks regarding charge question 1?
Jim? Yeah, I just have a question. In that list of topics, I'm not sure if this is captured in there, but I think a couple of us questioned what I would recommend that there's a summary paragraph to say, how did EPA take the quantitative data and put that in real world context and come up with a yes or no answer. And just a summary paragraph, something like that. I would call a risk characterization paragraph.
Jim, I remember I took notes on that comment that you made yesterday, and it is spot on, because that's what we all want to do, right? Take data and then what's the story here? So I will add that into our summary. Thank you for reminding me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Rainier?
So this is a question, but it came back to some of the discussions on the ranking of the bacteria, depending on how you use the occurrence data in the US or outside, the inclusion would change. So I guess one consideration we could make or suggest is to maybe rather deal with the uncertainty of the data, and basically instead of having one set value, come up with a range, which is probably more realistic anyhow. And that would make it easier to understand why some are more likely to be included and others pose less of a risk. So going away from those hard numbers to more of a high, medium, low, or even just as I said, a range, that might capture some of the discussion we had.
Rainier, that's a good comment. And both Jim and Rainier, if I could ask you if you would want to write up a paragraph or write up your comment for inclusion, then I can characterize it exactly. See, you speak up, Rainier, and then you get assignment. If that would be okay.
Sure, I'd be glad to.
Sure.
Thank you, Rainier.
Yes, thank you both. I think it'll help to figure out how to frame those comments into the mold of the charge question, because they're both really important things to capture, and really appreciate the extra. Does anyone else have clarifying comments or remarks on charge question 1? Okay, seeing none, let's go ahead and move to charge question 2. And as a reminder, there we go. Charge question 2 is, please comment on the process used to derive the draft CCL5, including but not limited to the CCL5 improvements to assess potential drinking water exposure, consider sensitive subpopulations, and prioritize contaminants that represent the greatest potential public health concern. So Angela, would you like to provide a summary for charge 2?
I'm happy to. Thank you for the opportunity. In listening to Dr. Adams' comments and summaries of question 1, I think there might be some overlap of the terminology of the phrasing of the questions, because a lot of my comments here sort of spill over and vice versa. So there was some perhaps unclear question stem terminology. So I'll try to stick with what the reviewers wrote specifically in regards to considering sensitive population and prioritizing contaminants representing the greatest public health concern. So overall, the process was clear and transparent. That was mentioned by several folks. In defining who are the sensitive populations at risk. There were comments about that there might be uncertainties about who these folks are, and they could be better acknowledged in terms of phrasing. For example, who are those with chronic disease? Who are those individuals with serious illness? Fairly vague. There might be some opportunity for comments on why immunosuppressed individuals are not considered sensitive populations. There was one comment on the relative balance between occurrence data and outbreak data. If one weighed more heavily, yet they weren't, the relevant chemicals weren't included on the list, does this still impact sensitive populations equally as the general population? There were some specific opportunities for improved clarification regarding prioritization of contaminants representing the greatest public health concerns. One was that the FRN described health effects of pathogens, but not necessarily of chemicals or chemical groups. And within each chemical group, perhaps there was less clarity on prioritization within the chemical groups. I think there was a comment about cyanotoxins and how they should belong here, and provide an opportunity for clarification regarding this point. Did all of the PFAS chemicals from PCCL 5 carry over to the draft? There was one comment about potential consideration of chemical isomers and consideration of other endocrine systems, for example, estrogens, alpha beta, thyroid alpha beta. The models from the Office of Pesticides Programs likely underestimate pesticides exposures from urban applications, and also the detection limits for exposure should also be considered in the various studies. My personal comments, the two big ones is perhaps consider the term health risks rather than health effects. To be more consistent with standard epidemiological terminology, and the scoring system for microbial health risks going from 1 through 7 should perhaps be looked at again to make sure that you all wanted to weight them equally. In general, data extraction of the quoted papers, some of them included older, perhaps even non-peer reviewed papers, from conference proceedings, et cetera. And like Dr. Adams mentioned, potentially checking of non-US databases could serve as a flag for US problems. That I hope is a good summary of charge question number 2. Again, there's some overlap with thoughts in question 1. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was a very thorough summary. Does anyone have any clarifying remarks regarding charge question 2 and Angela's synopsis? Okay, seeing none, we can go ahead and move on to charge question 3. And charge question 3 is, based on your expertise and experience, are there any contaminants currently on the draft CCL 5 that should not be listed? Please provide peer-reviewed information or data to support your conclusion. And so we'll go to Celine now for a synopsis.
Thank you so much. I think that Dr. Adams and Dr. Leung did a really good job at capturing a lot of the comments. And like it's been said before, there's some overlapping throughout the discussion and when the questions were asked. So I would just highlight what has already been said by Dr. Adams and Leung. The first one is comments that were made in reference to the consideration for including lithium, vanadium, and manganese. And there was a lengthy discussion about what concentrations and how long it would take to arrive to a level of concern. And the calculations that were made on the fly may differ from what's in the actual tables in the supplementary material that the EPA provided. And so the question is to consider the advantage or disadvantages and actual risk of continuing listing lithium, vanadium, and manganese in the CCL5. The other comments that were made about potentially not listing contaminants or microbes or viruses were in reference to viruses and bacteria that are currently regulated by the Safe Water Treatment Rule and the Groundwater Rule, and perhaps that some justification around the rationale for including them or not including them would be beneficial, as well as another Helicobacter pylori was also questioned as to the rationale for including it in the CCL5, given that the methods that were used are outdated and the actual methods were questionable. I think those are the major highlights. There was a lot of overlapping in the questions, particularly regarding PFAS and how to group them or include or maybe modify the definition of PFAS.
Thank you, Celine. Does anyone have any clarifying comments on charge question 3? And I'd just like to acknowledge that maybe after we hear about charge question 4, we'll think about them together since they are so interrelated.
Yes, June, I'd like to follow up on that. Okay. First of all, I'd like to say that I don't object to including any of these things in CCL5. I just would sound a note of caution on certain ones. Clearly, if we were to use something in water treatment that might have a health effect, we would want to regulate that. And so some of these metals may sometime in the future, 10 years from now, could be used in that capacity. So I just like to sound a note of caution on certain ones. Now, yesterday, I made my preliminary comments. I included 3 metals. Yesterday, I also mentioned cobalt, but I'd like to retract those comments. And I didn't hear you mention cobalt, Celine, which is good because I'm not questioning cobalt. But I would like to also consider a note of caution on tungsten based on what I've looked into. Tungsten is not a rare earth element, but it's not as common in our environment as the other 3 metals. But the 90th, if I look at the information in the supporting document, I see that there were only 21 public water supplies, only 21, but the highest one had the equivalent, it had 22 micrograms per liter in the water. So we assume, this time I assume 2 liters of consumption per day and 70 kilogram body weight. That's equivalent to 6.3 times 10 to the negative 4 milligrams per kilogram per day dosage that we would be consuming in drinking water. So then I compare that to the listed in the documentation. There's a listed equivalent of an RFD. There's no RFD because this is not an IRIS at all, but it listed a number of 8 times 10 to the negative 4. And there were 2 supporting documents that I looked up. One of them simply said, I think it was from ATSDR, that there was not much known. But the other one was an EPA analysis, and they came up with an RFD of 8 times 10 to the negative 4. And I assume that's why that is kind of close to the amount in the drinking water. And therefore, I assume that's how it ended up there. But when I look at the NOAEL, the no observed adverse effect level, it was 47 milligrams per kilogram per day. No effect at 47 milligrams per kilogram per day. So that's it. That's like taking 3 pills of sodium tungstate, and these pills would be on the heavy side, and you take them every day. So, and then you'd have no effect. So it looks to me like there were several uncertainty factors applied, and but we're 5 orders of magnitude apart here. So I would just sound a note of caution there.
And James?
Sure.
James, this is Selena again. I am so sorry about the cobalt, but I guess that was a lucky mistake.
No, I like to retract it anyway.
Great. We're on the same page. So I was just wondering if you can have a write-up on this last observation. I thought it was very interesting. I just didn't get, I didn't write fast enough to capture all the thoughts. So if you can just share it with me and the rest of the committee, if that's the process, that would be great.
I would be glad to. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. And this is making me think that perhaps it's we can figure out, and maybe this will be a comment that I go ahead and make for, I think it would be charge question 1 of how to EPA can improve the presentation of the information, because these pretty simple calculations that you've been talking about, Dr. Engelhardt, with just looking at the no observed effect level and the highest possible concentration that we have like legitimately understood, and making a little comparison, it seems like that would not be a tremendous extra effort to add into the documentation, and could be done for the whichever contaminants that information is available for. So I really appreciate the way you've walked us through that.
Glad to. Thank you, June.
Does anyone else have comments for charge question 3 or clarifying remarks? Okay, seeing none, let's go ahead and move to Mark for charge question 4, which reads, based on your expertise and experience, are there any contaminants which are currently not on the draft CCL5 that should be listed? Please provide peer-reviewed information or data to support your conclusion. So we'll turn to Mark.
All right, well, I will beg a little mercy on this, and some of the comments just came this morning. So I thought Craig did a great job in making the committee look brilliant on question 1. It'll take some work to get us to the same level on 4. One of the comments was on antibiotics or antimicrobials. It noted the large use of antibiotics, particularly in animal feed, perhaps also in aquaculture, and the impact of that is certainly on receiving streams. And so, asking the question on antibiotics that might be in drinking water, but then also really driving those antibiotics in the source water and receiving streams, driving antibiotic resistant microorganisms. And although that's not specifically on the question, I wonder whether we need to be asking EPA to look at genetic elements of antibiotic resistant genes and potential transfer in impact on microbes in water. So this question of antibiotics, but also then its subsequent ecological impacts and potential risks in drinking water. Also included on 4, and again, this may be a little bit of overlap, but it's always the rule of 7 in communication. So we're only on 4 here, the 4th question, but the expansive definition of PFAS and whether or not that adds additional chemicals for EPA to consider in the CCL5. A comment was made on microplastics are widely known to accumulate the environmental waters, and although the health effects are still unclear, they're found in raw waters and in drinking waters. And I just thought if the committee could, if there's expertise in the committee that could kind of, provide a little bit more support, while microplastics themselves may not be health effects, they may carry chemicals that could, and so we have this comment, but it probably could use a little bit more health effects support. And then the comments this morning on the group of mycobacteria being in there, and then a couple. Again, I'm not sure where this fits. It's not necessarily adding a contaminant, but talking about processes that could influence contaminants that be adding. Identify byproducts, impurity, and transformation products, including degradates that in the evaluation process that again could add compounds to the list. The process should also include a focus on persistent and mobile organic compounds to serve to identify and prioritize chemicals of concern for drinking water. And then there was just kind of one catch-all about the change in USGS National Water Quality Assessment Program is discontinuing its contaminant monitoring. And so the kind of question for EPA in future strategy developments is how this is going to be picked up. And then the committee seems to have some debate here on whether some of the microbes on CCL 4 should or should not be carried. But over onto CCL 5, we just had this discussion around adenoviruses and hepatitis and salmonella, and I think ultimately that does fall into that charge question number 1, being more transparent of the reasons why or why not, so that those decisions could be understood and then more scientifically debated once it was clear what the rationale are. I also am waiting for some comments on bisphenol compounds, other bisphenol compounds, some other cyanotoxins. in nanomaterials. We have microplastics, but not nanomaterials came up on Wednesday. I have no text around that. As far as occurrence and health risks on nanomaterials, that needs to be added. I think that's it. So there's still a little bit of work to be done in pulling question 4 together.
Thank you. That was very thorough. It does sound like maybe there is a opportunity for those with the experience and expertise in the nanomaterials to provide Mark with additional support, either in your written revisions to your preliminary comments or new comments. Am I hearing that?
Yeah, so if anyone has that with his send that, I'm happy to write it up. It's on the list, and absent that, I'll try to do it myself. But you're talking to microbiologists trying to write up something on nanomaterials, so I'm certain there's expertise on the group far better than mine.
Thank you. Dr. Sutton, I see your hands up. I don't know if it's relevant to this request or something different.
Yeah, it is relevant to microplastics. I am not up on the human health effects, but I can share that the state of California is working on microplastics in drinking water. So I can probably track down some of their rationale and documentation to help out in that area.
Great.
And this is Selene. I sent those documents this morning, so maybe you have not received the email, but I sent a number of reviews that talk about the nanomaterial. So I just sent it this morning. So
I stand corrected. Yes, I saw that, but I didn't have a chance to review it. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Does anyone else have clarifying remarks regarding charge question 4 and Mark's synopsis?
Yes, June, I could make a comment. I don't have expertise. I do agree that California is the leader in microplastics research. I don't think anybody's an expert on it at this point, and I don't know much. But from my knowledge, if we took, for example, polypropylene, in my opinion, I don't have any questions about its toxicity, and I couldn't find any serious questions about it. But they can add additives. I don't know if they're colors or whatever. Nobody knows. It's all proprietary. But it's the additives that can leach out of the polypropylene that can sometimes have a health effect. So I don't, at this point, have any, peer-reviewed publications to cite. If you do need something, I can look into it.
Jim, that would be great if you could, take 15 minutes and see what you can find. I think certainly we know that microplastics can accumulate. So, there's kind of one issue there. Then the transport of hazardous chemicals that would bind to the microplastics. When I was in my position at American Water, this was an area I was concerned and following it fairly closely. I've stepped away from it for the last couple of years, but I agree with the comment that this should be put in. It's not. We have a number of these that kind of fall in that aren't clear chemicals. They're not clear microbes, but there are other like nanomaterials and what have you that probably should be on there. And and maybe a couple other process, and then we have a catch-all for kind of process issues. And I do note that we had some discussion around other exposures from water, like hot water, and changes that could occur in there. And whether or not that's, again, part of EPA's thinking on the process around transformation or accumulation or increased health effects from changes in temperature, for example.
Yes, Mark, could I follow up? Yeah, I agree completely. Accumulation is a huge issue with microplastics. And other plastics, not polypropylene, commonly have the bisphenols in them. So there are multiple issues here, which I don't think we know much about at this point. So it might be more, I don't know. I don't know if it would be something that would go into this CCL, but we need to look at those.
Well, I reflect on what June brought up on the Wednesday call, that the charge is to have known or, anticipated health effects. And that set me back to kind of, consider, well, we may not have evidence, but it would be reasonable to make some assumptions of health effects from that might be anticipated. So I think CCL is the time to bring that up. And if it's not even a part of the process for consideration, it can't get the light of day. So I think these are really good comments. Hopefully they'll be incorporated.
Rebecca?
Yeah, I had one more thought to share along the lines of the idea to add the class of bisphenols. And that might be whether we would want to recommend adding a chemical class of organophosphate esters. And I think Dr. Lohman brought this up earlier in terms of the rationale for why certain chemicals were listed as classes and others weren't. And so I wonder if we'd want to consider organophosphate esters as a class, since there were several in the longer preliminary list. And at least a few maybe made it to the draft CCL.
Thank you. It does, I have been thinking about how each CCL leads to the next, and remembering including on the CCL is just the beginning of EPA's process to figure out, whether the particular contaminant or group can or should be regulated. And to the extent that EPA needs to rely on what happens in the previous CCLs, it could make a lot of sense to go ahead and include something like these agents that you've just mentioned, the organophosphate esters or the polypropylene, because then they're in that anticipated group, and even if they're not chosen for potential regulation now, then there's kind of a frame of reference. The flip side, of course, of that is sort of what happens with Helicobacter, where we have information today and then it kind of lingers without a clear chance to really reassess. So I feel like this is a little bit of my meta comment and a question I have for EPA staff, which is whether we, as part of our charge, have an opportunity to comment on the charge and to obviously not change what we're being asked to do today, but to offer comments on how the consultation with the augmented committee could be changed in the future. And I don't know whether the way this happens is like statutorily set, or whether there is an opportunity for EPA to modify it, and whether this is the right venue to be offering up a comment such as that.
June, this is Carolyn. Are you asking directly right now, or are you just kind of posing this question to the committee?
I think
Are you seeking direct answer from EPA?
And I admit, as the chair who is responsible for making sure that we don't diverge into policy, and away from our actual charge questions, I don't want to get to cross a line that we need to respect.
Sure.
So I think it's a question for you, EPA, of it actually is a question of does the question that I just posed cross that line into starting to think about policy? I mean, it really is it's a question about the questions.
Right.
And I think we've all struggled with figuring out how they fit together and how we separately consider them. And I want to commend the committee for really being careful about trying to disentangle where each of our comments fits. But as a result, and I think because this process won't get repeated again for 5 years, I would, if there is an opportunity for us to capture our comments on how this committee functions, is that now, is that later, is that never? Yeah.
I'll pause and see if anybody from Office of Water wants to respond. Otherwise, I'd be happy to as DFO, but I just want to offer the opportunity. Yeah.
Or if it's something that you consider and return to us, that's fine with me as well.
I don't see anybody raising their hand. So from my perspective, the committee can offer their recommendations on how to improve the process that they've just proceeded through, and that can be included in the report that you all write up, maybe elaborating on how more clearly defined charge questions would have facilitated an easier discussion, or whatever conclusions you all come to of how you would see the modification of this process benefiting how you all proceed. Does that answer your question?
It absolutely does.
Okay,
Yeah.
Great.
And Dr. Lemon, did you have, I see your hand.
I just had a question as we write up our deliberations. As part of the BOSC, we had to separate out suggestions, which were many to very few recommendations. We go through the same exercise here.
Repeat that question? You separate out
suggestions, which we had many, to recommendations, which we only had very few, or were only allowed very few, basically.
I see. There's no specific, requirement to separate out suggestions as opposed to recommendations. Making it clear in the report would probably be helpful to EPA to see which, is more heavily, what comments are more heavily weighted from the committee's perspective, but there's no requirement to do so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That potentially provides us a nice segue to our last item. But before we move on, I just want to make sure if anyone has any additional clarifying comments or remarks regarding the charge questions or the synopses that were just presented. Okay, well, seeing none, I would like to thank all of you for your participation and involvement. And thank you, EPA, for providing us the opportunity to review the draft CCL5. And thank you to the CCL5 committee members today, yesterday, and our first iteration of this meeting were very productive. And I really appreciated everybody's discussion and the opportunity to engage with you. So I will now turn it back over to Carolyn, who can review our next steps.
Great. Thank you, June. I think Frank, if you'd be able to share the slide, I have a tentative timeline for next steps that I've established, but there's room for suggestions if anyone thinks it's unreasonable, any of these requests. But okay, so the first, our first, next step that we're going to do is each one of you can return to your comments and revise them as you see necessary, or, throughout the discussion today, some of the committee members or lead writers asked for some elaborations or additional materials to be sent. So if you all could do that and send them to me by February 28th, that would be greatly appreciated. If you don't have any revisions to make to your comments, if you could also just send me an email and let me know that your original comments, stand as is, that would be helpful for me to track what I should expect in the next, 10 or so days. So following that, after I receive the revised comments, I'll again compile everything together and send it out to the committee, specifically to the lead writers who can utilize that in writing up their synopsis and their responses to the charge. As a note, I will also be posting it online for the public to view. And so, let's see, I have to move this, I'm just blocking it. Okay, so on February 28th, then I'll send it out to the rest of the committee. Then we'll come up to March 7th. If the lead writers could have their draft responses, not final yet, but send them to your teammates and also CC myself and CC June. And then so between the 7th and the 14th, the lead writers and your team, you all can work on finalizing your response and getting it set to how you want it portrayed in the report. And so on the 14th, the lead writer could send me and June their final draft of their responses. And I will then take the first attempt at compiling all that is provided to me to create a cohesive sort of one voice report. I have the target of April 8th to complete that by, and then I will send it to June, who will edit and review the report. And then let's see here. So so by the 18th, hopefully we'll have it ready to be posted. And then the next meeting that we will have will be around April, early May, hopefully, if everything plays out as it's laid out here. And I will send out a poll like I did for these meetings, seeking availability so that we all can come together and you can, as a committee, discuss the report and make any modifications and make sure that it's portraying what your perspective and your opinions are. Yes, so does anyone have any questions regarding all that I just said? You see Celine, is that your hand up?
Yeah, thanks, Caroline.
Okay. Yes.
So for March 7th, it says to draft the response and send it to the team members. So we are defining team members as the people that were included for the charge questions, right?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Oh, also another note, I do say to CC me and the chair, but that goes with all communications. If you could please CC me just so that I can keep a record, which is required. Dr. Engelhardt?
Yes, Carolyn. So could you remind me what DFO stands for?
Designated federal officer. That's me.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we so we send our individual comments to our lead writer and copy you.
Yes, please.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? And if after this meeting, anybody comes up with a question that isn't answered, please feel free to reach out to me or June, email, or you can call me if it's easier and more direct. I don't, it doesn't have to be just through email. Okay, I'm Dr. Engelhardt, I'm assuming your hand's up from your previous question. You're on mute if you're, okay, there we go. All right, so it looks like we're all finished. I just want to offer my gratitude for all of the effort that the entire committee has put into this process already and the effort that is to come. I appreciate it, EPA appreciates it, and it's a great addition to everything that we do here at the agency. I will be in contact with you all. I'll either send out an email today or Monday or Tuesday with the next steps, you know, outlining what's on this slide here that you're viewing. Yep, and let's see, we're at 1:54 p.m. Eastern time. And with that, I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you all so much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Yeah.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.
Bye.